Hello, everyone. Hello to the other people at home. So this evening we have the wonderful pleasure of being joined by Philip Carr-Gomm on behalf of the Ovates Psychedelic Society. Welcome. So I'd just like to, I will introduce Philip, and then we will have some questions, and then we will speak. There will be some sort of conversation, and then we will have some questions. Okay, so Philip Carr-Gomm studied psychology at University College London and trained as a psychotherapist at the Institute of Psychosynthesis, yes. Psychosynthesis, as well as studying play therapy under Dr. Rosalind Watts. He also has been an educator and a teacher. He founded a Montessori school in Lewes, in Sussex, and has worked throughout his career in sophrology and is an advisor to the Sophrology Institute. Philip is also a prolific author, having written on topics that have fascinated him for his whole career, including works on English magic, sacred places, embodied self-development, as well as a very well-reviewed novel, and the history of nakedness, amongst many, many other publications. We will look into. In 1988, he was asked to lead the Order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids, a role that he maintained for almost 35 years. He brought the order from near obscurity to one of the largest druidic organizations in the world, and has been a leading figure in neo-paganism and nature spirituality ever since. Professor Ronald Hutton, who's a history professor at Magdalen, has stated that the initiation course Carr-Gomm developed when he took over the order arguably, and I quote, arguably represents one of the major documents of British spirituality from of the late 20th century. In 2020, Philip passed on the road to his successor, and today he continues to practice Druidry while developing his work in psychology, psychotherapy, and psychedelic medicine. He has most recently been an advisor for the Synthesis Institute in the Netherlands, which is perhaps the most important psychedelic retreat center in Europe, and has, together with the clinical researcher Rosalind Watts, been developing ACER, a new model for integrating psychedelic experiences in community groups. So I'd like to give a warm welcome to Philip Carr-Gomm. Okay, so I thought we'd begin firstly with your work on Druidry, because I think a lot of people here are interested in that, and then move on to psychotherapy and psychedelics in the sort of second half. But well, I guess of course I have to ask you this question, which is, what is Druidry?
Well, let's. Thank you, Philip. It's very rare to meet another Philip. Thank you for inviting me. Druidry is a spirituality that is, on the one hand, inspired by a very ancient tradition, pre-Christian pagan tradition, and on the other hand, is a very modern kind of spirituality as well, because it only has a kind of written records for the last 300 years. But it's a spirituality that seems very well suited to the world we find ourselves in today. And it's a spirituality that invites us to connect in a very deep way with the natural world. And I wondered even if we start in a particular way, in a druidic way. Should we do that?
Yeah.
Time together this evening. There's a very interesting professor of religious studies in the States called Christopher Batch, I think it's spelled pronounced B-A-C-H-E, wrote a book called Learning Fields. He spent 20 years researching psychedelics himself, personally, and most of the time in secret, and then came out more recently and has written about it. And he's written a very interesting book called, I think it's called Learning Fields, where he becomes very interested in the classes he has. He experiences telepathy, essentially. He starts off in a very simple way by knowing, when you've taught a particular subject for many years, You know the sorts of questions people are going to ask, and you know the answers you can give. But sometimes he finds his mind coming up with unusual responses to people. And he learns not to question that, but to simply give this response. And then people will come up to him afterwards and say, it's extraordinary you mentioned that, because my mother this morning was saying, blah, blah, blah. You know, and there are, it's kind of important insights that come. So he learns to trust this more and more, particularly, I suppose, with his psychedelic experiences kind of running in parallel, to trust his intuition, and to trust this idea that we're living in a field of consciousness, and that we're not separate in that way. So there's a way in which we can all be sitting here now, and in some senses, we're bound to feel separate as we sit on our chairs individually here in the room. And yet, the invitation, I suppose, is for us to be open to something more than that sense of egoic separation. And perhaps, if to the degree that you wish to, I think it's really important in this thing, you may not kind of be in the mood for it. So if you want to just listen and not follow along, that's absolutely fine, of course. But maybe, if you felt like closing your eyes to better concentrate on yourself, or lowering your gaze. And just becoming aware, first of all, of just yourself sitting in this room, your kind of physical location in this room. And in the sense that you're not alone, that there are these other beings in this room. There are about, 80 of us or something in this room. These other beings. Let's just tune in and see if we can sense these other beings. And we don't have to put words on it, but there's just some sense of we kind of know that we're not alone. Sitting here, I can feel that I'm not alone. And now what we do in Druidry, from a Druid perspective, is we maybe allow our sense of the walls around us and the ceiling above us to start to fade, and to allow our sense of the floor beneath us to fade as well, as we find ourselves seated on the grass with the sky above us. And there's this sense of the buildings around us here, these wonderful beings that are kind of rooted in time and history. And it's probably quite easy for us to sense the buildings around us becoming wonderful old trees, hundreds and hundreds of years old, their roots reaching down to the earth. And we're in a clearing. We're surrounded by these trees, and it's just like the sacred grove of the Druids. This clearing in the forest, surrounded by our friends, our brothers and sisters, the trees, rooted deep in the earth, rooted in time. And opening to a sense of the earth beneath us, we can feel the stability of the earth, bringing us a sense of calm, connection, the healing energy of the earth. And you might find that healing energy sort of flowing up into your body, bringing you a sense of stability and healing. And then let's become aware now of the trees around us. The sky above us. And as you become aware of the sky above you, breathe in the energy of the sky, allowing the energy of the sky to meet the energy of the earth within the center of your being. And then just being aware of everyone seated around in this clearing. Let's ask that we have an inspiring time together, a warm, human, connected time together. And may all our lives be blessed. May all life be blessed. And may the earth be blessed. And then gradually allowing your awareness to come back to yourself, seated, just getting a sense of the trees starting to fade as they become buildings again. The walls, the floor above us, the ceiling above us rather, the floor beneath us, just the roof walls. As we become aware, fully conscious of being seated here and now in this room together. And when you feel ready, you open your eyes, fully present here and now.
Well, thank you. I just wanted to pick up on something you said earlier, which is about the importance of the relevance of Druidry now, and it reminds me of a beautiful piece of writing that you made in 1990 called. I'm picking out of the archives there, but and I encourage everyone at home and in the audience to look at this because it's a really beautiful essay called Why Druidry? Why Druidry Now? That you wrote. And there's something that you wrote there, and I'm paraphrasing, maybe I have it in my notes, but talking about how the interest in earth religions can be is seen as regressive, but rather it is progressive because we meet this wisdom at a new turn of the spiral. And I wonder what you mean by that.
Well, in that little experience we had, it was very brief, wasn't it? Just like 5 minutes, just slowing down a bit and coming to a sense of the earth beneath us, the trees around us. There's that sense of kind of immediacy and importance of the natural world. And when I wrote that in 1990, I think it was in 1990, what had happened is there'd been the Club of Rome report in the 1970s, which alerted a lot of people to the impending environmental crisis. But the majority of people kind of weren't switched on to it at all in the way that they are now. And then there were the big fires in Yosemite, I think in '88. We had the hurricane in '87, I can't remember. This extraordinary hurricane that hit Britain. Something like 4 million trees felt, blown over. And there was this sense that people were kind of waking up to the environmental crisis. And so that's the context in which I wrote that. And there's a way in which an ecological spirituality, a spirituality that talks about the earth and the land, suddenly becomes very modern and very relevant. So it's not regressive at all. Yeah.
And it's interesting that you say that that it was very much time. I remember, if I may go on, I'm quoting yourself back to you. You talked about in that essay about how the 60s had a strong. There was this sense of the sacred medicine, that was opening people up, and then the 70s was a period of gurus and of great teachers that had sort of come to the West to spread what we can broadly call nature spirituality and to the masses. And that in the 80s this had become something about, it had turned into a sort of self-development and human potential kind of movement and self-help and all of these things, and the individualism, right? And that you were trying to usher something into this new decade. And I wonder how, reflecting back on your thoughts at the time and to the current meta crisis that we find ourselves in now.
Yeah, okay. In that, just a little correction. When I talked about the 70s with the gurus, they weren't bringing nature spirituality in. That was the point. They were bringing in spiritual development and self-development, but not nature spirituality. What I was trying to do is I was trying to kind of paint a broad brush picture. It's interesting what you've invited me to do in terms of, now we're 30 years on from when I wrote that, there's a way in which, if we look at it like this, we look at the collective consciousness of humanity. You have the First World War, the Second World War, that throws everything up in the air, changes so much in terms of people's consciousness. And then you have the 50s, and it seemed perhaps slightly absurd to suggest that the beatniks and the kind of avant-garde movements of the 50s were part of some kind of seeding of alternative ways of seeing the world and of dealing with consciousness. But certainly, whilst that may be a little far stretched to go, when we move into the 60s, something very clear seems to have happened. It's as if we were a group of sort of angelic beings looking down on the earth saying, look at these poor souls, look at the mess they're making of the world, what can we do? We've tried the beatniks and that hasn't helped much. We need something stronger than William Burroughs' poetry or something. Let's get them taking psychedelics and smoking pot. So there was this, the whole period of flower power and all the rest of it, which was, happened when I was a teenager. So that was sort of a key era for me. And it was like, essentially, a mass initiation project. Suddenly, thousands and thousands of people were being turned on to the reality that the everyday consensus reality wasn't the only reality, that actually life was far more extraordinary and wonderful and beautiful and amazing than they had been led to believe by the powers that be. Hence Leary telling everybody to tune in and drop out. So that happened, and then what I experienced, and I think that it's fair to say other people did as well, is you had that wave through the 60s, very exciting time, opening up to that. And then it peaked, and then there was a backwash. So amongst our friends, you had the people who get caught in the drug culture, who got caught in the backwash, and who went downhill and so on, all sorts of problems involved in that. But the people who carried on surfing into the 70s, then the gurus arrived. They said, okay, the drug thing, that's worked to some degree, now send in the gurus. And all the gurus came in. And so thousands of people were getting into meditation. I mean, even the word meditation wasn't used. You wouldn't have seen it used in the way it's now used. It's very commonplace. In those days, Maharishi did an amazing job with that, transcendental meditation and the rest of it. And that was the next wave. But then, as you got towards the end of the 70s, they started to get they were being busted for tax dodging. And if you look at the stories of Guru, it's quite fascinating because again, there's this backwash where it kind of goes wrong, and you get the whole development of cults towards the end of the 70s. You had I'm starting to forget them now, but the Jonestown, and so they looked down and they said, okay, they need something else now, because I think there was a tremendous value in these movements, you see. But I think it's naive to think that they were all good, because there were all sorts of problematic issues around all of these phases. So, okay, let's get a bit more hard-nosed about this. Those guys in the States are really good with psychology. Let's get the human potential movement going, and let's get the psychologists in on the act, let's studying it and looking at it. Leary and Alpert became Ramdas were psychologists, but they took so much acid they weren't psychologists anymore. And of course Ramdas turned into a guru. And I think, bless him, he was one of the gurus that didn't, that was always amazing right to the very end. And certainly my and then you had that interesting phase of the human potential movement. That's what transpersonal psychology coming in.
Yeah.
And so I was kind of trying.
Can I just point in who describes the transpersonal psychology?
Can I describe it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, what I was going to say.
Well, it's a very broad label, but.
I was just going to say. I was kind of tracking it. So I went through the 60s period and did all that stuff. So I had my psychedelic experiences in the 60s and so on. And in the 70s I met a guru and followed a guru for a while, and that was very exciting and interesting. And then I became disillusioned and left that, decided to become hard-nosed about it, started studying psychology, and then...
Do you think that was a kind of reaction to the experience that you had with that guru?
Oh, absolutely. I was sitting in this ashram in the south of France with about 200 people. We were all meditating. He was incredibly high meditating. I mean, we used to be, I used to feel like I was glued to this rock. Extremely extraordinary experiences, transcendental experiences. But I knew at some stage that there was something very wrong with this. There was something fabulous and right about it, but something wrong as well. And what was wrong, basically, was about 1,000 people in love with one person. And that's a recipe for disaster. Because, when 1,000 people love one person, for starters, everybody pretends to be nice to each other, but they're really all trying to get closer to the guy. And what's the reason you're feeling so good is because of all the, we talked about these neurochemicals over here, weren't we? What are they?
Oxytocin.
Oxytocin, that's it. You're getting oxytocin and dopamine and serotonin, all that stuff. The ill part of when you fall in love. Falling in love is wonderful, but it is like a kind of illness. You become obsessed with the person you think about them all the time. So that's what 1,000 people were doing, and it was as if it was a very powerful experience for me. It was as I was sitting on this rock, very deep in meditation. I opened my eyes, and it was as if the spell had been lifted. Somebody had removed the spell, and I saw hundreds of people gazing doe-eyed up at the guru. And I was just seeing the scene from a different perspective, and it felt incredibly unhealthy and not right. So I left and moved into the transpersonal. I thought I've got to get sensible about this and get hard-nosed about it. So then I went to UCL and did a degree in psychology, and that's coming from an ashram to the UCL psychology department. It's like hitting a runway at 100 miles an hour, and I studied psychosynthesis and Jungian analysis as well. And you asked me about transpersonal psychology.
Yes.
Okay, so lots of ways you can talk about it, but the simplest way is to say, a psychology that recognises the dimension of spirit and of the soul.
Yeah. And psychosynthesis, which is a particular lineage.
It's a particular, So there's this guy called Roberto Assagioli, who was the first Freudian analyst in Italy, and then he converted to being the first Jungian analyst in Italy, and then he was also a pupil of Alice Bailey, who was involved in the arcane schools, the magical, the esoteric tradition, spiritual lineage, and he developed his own psychology, which he called psychosynthesis. And so that we've got now, we're talking about the 1980s, and then in this very rough, broad brush picture to decades, in the 90s, the environmental crisis really became more and more apparent. And then you had the renaissance of interest in earth-based spiritualities. People started becoming interested in Native American spirituality, Australian Aboriginal spirituality, and in Druidry, and in paganism. And there was a kind of renaissance. There was a kind of double dip renaissance in Druidry in the 1960s with the sort of flower power generation, kind of my generation, getting interested in Druidry, and then in the 90s when people became interested in paganism and nature spirituality. I haven't tracked the decades since then. We've got 2 decades. Yeah.
A little bit hard. It's more.
Well, okay. Let's do it now. You've got the way I see it is you had this negative initiation. I think there's in my studies of nakedness, I discovered an interesting thing, which was that the AIDS, when AIDS hit, it was the same time. John, you know that really powerful photograph of John Lennon naked, curled up with Yoko Ono?
Taken by Andy Lipovitz.
Yeah, taken the day before, I believe, he was shot. And it's so powerful because it was also that time, I think it was 1990 actually, the thing about nakedness is you're incredibly vulnerable when you're naked. So there's an extraordinary amount of trust and innocence in the naked state. And he was expressing that because he was curled up like a little baby there. And then you had AIDS and people's relationship to their bodies and fear of sexuality and all the difficulty of it all. The difficulty of it all came in. And But looking back at this progression of spiritual sort of awakening, I suppose you'd say, in the 21st century, sort of, it's equivalent to that, it's probably wrong to say that, but what happened was we had 9/11, which was this awful kind of awakening, in a way, to the shadow side of our civilization, humanity, in a way. People used to say, oh, everything will get back to normal. And I remember once I was driving, I can remember it so clearly, I was driving from Brighton to Lewis towards the Amex Stadium, and this voice said to me, if you think nothing's changed, you absolutely haven't understood. And then I just started crying. And the you wasn't me personally, it was like people haven't understood. If people think that nothing has changed. Yeah. So we had a sort of period of incredible realism, if you like, or difficulty through, and how it worked in consciousness. I can't quite get it at the moment, but in the next, maybe what was happening, and certainly in 2020, was the psychedelic renaissance, which is part of this renaissance.
Yeah. When did you first become aware of that? When was that?
I became aware of it over a cup of tea. David Luke, who's a psychology professor at Greenwich, asked if he could bring a friend round for tea. And it was in one of those, do you remember during the lockdown when you had like some days, sometimes you could meet 3 people outside, and other days it was 4, and it just got so complicated. And I kind of lost track of what was legal and what was illegal. But I always said, yeah, sure. And he came over with Rosalind Watts, and we spent the whole afternoon together, and she told me about the psychedelic renaissance. And I was completely unaware of it. I hadn't, we all have our areas of interest. And I just hadn't come across it at all, and I listened to her and David, and Googled away in the evening when she'd gone, and the next day she offered me a job with the program called the Connectedness Programme, working with people from the Imperial College trials on treatment-resistant depression.
Was this before you were involved? It was before synthesis.
Sorry?
Before synthesis.
Well, this was with synthesis.
Right.
She was working through synthesis with the Imperial College, or some of the Imperial College.
Well, for those who don't know, Rosalind Watts, whom Philip collaborates with closely, is a clinical psychiatrist who was the clinical lead on the psychologist, who developed she was the clinical lead on what is arguably one of the most important clinical trials in the psychedelic renaissance, which is Psychedelic, which was the trial that, for many people, kind of affirmed the effectiveness of psilocybin as a treatment for depression. Was this a trial that you wrote?
Well, the way it developed was in the clinical trial, they had factored in only 2 post-psychedelic sessions, only 2 integration therapy sessions with the clients. And Rosalind felt very strongly that they needed more integration work. Because if you can think about it, these were people suffering from treatment-resistant depression, so they tried everything, really at the end of their tether. They took psilocybin. A lot of them found it incredibly helpful in alleviating the symptoms of depression. But of course, they were dropping back into the same lives, the same work, the same relationships, and so on. And they needed support to integrate the experiences from the psilocybin sessions into their life and to sort of build on that. But because Imperial College hadn't factored in more than 2 sessions, she managed to persuade the Synthesis Institute, which is an institute based in the Netherlands and now in Oregon, to fund a program where we worked with those who wanted to receive more support. And so through the lockdown period, really, we carried on doing online work with them over that period.
I will get into exactly how you did that and the process that you developed as a result of that. But I want to go back for a second And I want to ask you about your Druidry practice. And so you were asked in 1988 to lead this order, but you had not been involved with it, or you had been recently involved with it. You had sort of left it for a long period of time.
Okay. Let me see if I can find a quick way of saying it. I first met my Druid teacher when I was 11. A big wake-up for me was when I was 11. I read a book called The Life of the Buddha by L. Adams Beck. Very florid, lyrical book, talking about the life of the Buddha. And I read it, and I thought, this is the only thing worth doing, gaining enlightenment. Why would you want to do anything else with your life? And my dad knew Christopher Humphreys, who had started, I think, the Buddhist Society in London. And so I sort of, through him, I had access to lots of books. And at the same time, he was working as a teacher in Ross Nichols' sort of crammers kind of college in West London. And Ross Nichols was the chief of the Order of Bards, Ovates and Druids. And so I met him at the same time when I was 11. So 11, fast forward to 16, I asked if I could train in Druidry with Ross Nichols, and he started to train me. When I was 17, I asked if I could be initiated into the order, and he said no, which was a wonderful experience for a teenager. He said, no, you have to be 18. And you know what it's like when you're a kid, it's like, oh my God, I have to wait that long. So when I was 18, I was initiated on Glastonbury tour. And I forgot what the question was.
No, it's fine, that's fine.
Oh yes, how I got to the 19. Yeah. Okay. And then I followed him until 1975, when he died suddenly, and I just about a year before he died, I had discovered this guru, and I was knocked out by him because he was so. The thing about Ross Nichols is that he wasn't charismatic. He taught me like a teacher teaches a kid maths. It sounds strange, but I mean, we did ceremonies with robes and all the gear. But when I did one, I used to take the tube round from Westminster, from St James's Park Station, where I was at Westminster School. I'd take the tube after school to his house in Barons Court. He'd open the door, and he'd say, oh, hello, and he'd come down, and he'd make me a cup of tea, and then he'd open a cupboard, and he'd take out text from the cupboard and say, right, so this evening I'm going to tell you about Stonehenge, and then he would read bits out and then make asides, and then jot little notes and so on. And then he'd say, any questions? And I'd ask a few questions, and then say, okay, I'll see you next week. And I'd go. So they were literally like lessons.
Like rote lessons.
Yeah, rote lessons, and I gradually amassed these teachings in
and when you were to give those teachings on to others, how did your teaching start? Because of course also you were Montessori.
Yes, that's just going to confuse us.
Anyway, we won't get into that. But of course you ended up teaching many of the same things.
Yeah. So what happened was he died, and for 7 years I followed this guru, which all went strangely wrong. I signed up into UCL psychology thing. I used to meditate every morning, and then I had one of those pivotal moments in my life. And I think you have, when you look back on your life, you find that there's certain sort of key times where you can trace such a lot to that one moment. And in this one moment, I was doing at that time a kind of meditation which, like Zazen, just open, where you're just sitting, just being open. And he came into the room, and he had died 9 years previously, and it was extraordinary because I'm not clairvoyant. I don't have these kind of experiences regularly at all. I've had a few kind of intimations or messages from people on the other people who died and so on, but not like this. And he told me, he asked me to do a number of things, and one of them was to find all of his books that he had published, because the sort of arrogant teenager I was, every so often he would give me one of his published books, and I was just waiting for him to eventually give me all of his 6 or 7 books that he had published. I tend to curtain go and buy them, and I'm embarrassed to say, and he said, gather all my books together, and then I want you to publish my book. He spent the last 2 years of his life writing a book, and he put £1,000 of his money into his will for it to be privately published if the publisher couldn't be found, and all that was ignored. So he was kind of, I think he was grumpy on the other side, that his book hadn't been published. So he said, get my book published, and I want you to start the order again, because it had died with him. I want you to start the order again, and when you were young, people had to learn Druidry by coming to me physically, which meant very few people actually made the trek physically. I want you to be able to send it out to people all over the world, because you may think it's anachronistic, but it's not. It's really relevant to the needs of today. So that was what he said. And then there followed the most extraordinary sequence of synchronistic events, which included me walking into Atlantis bookshop and just seeing straight ahead this twin-volume set of the history and practice of magic. I just literally opened the door and walked straight up, and I had this boxed set from him. I then went into, well, before that, actually, a few hours before, I went into a bookshop in Covent Garden and said, would you happen to have any books privately published by Ross Nichols during the war? And the guy said, no, I don't think so. Went downstairs, and he came back. He said, you're in luck. He came back with one book of Ross Nichols, with letters from Ross and sketches tied up with string. So there's this little package. He said, you can have that for £10. So I got that, and I went. I phoned a friend, a guy called Colin Murray, who did a tour, and I said to him, I said, can I come and see this extraordinary? Yesterday I had this extraordinary experience. And I told him the story, and I said, now I only have one more book to find. And he said, well, I've got a spare copy, and he gave me that copy. So within 24 hours, sort of mission 1 was completed, and then mission 2 was to have to find his book. And I remember that these old ladies who were quite sort of close to him. And I thought, I wonder if they, and I started to ring up, one of them had died just before she died. Oh yes, she had the manuscript, but she passed it to so-and-so. And then about three old ladies on, I found somebody who had it under her bed. And I said, look, I've got this here. He said, well, you can have it like that. And then I met John and Kathleen Matthews, who live in Oxford, who are prolific writers on cults and spirituality, and I told them the story. And they said, oh, we'll introduce you to a publisher. And then so I met this publisher for lunch, and he said, oh, we publish that. And so mission number 2 was... And then it just got stranger and stranger. Just one final story. There was the manuscript, but the illustrations file had become detached from the manuscript. So I had the manuscript, but in the manuscript it would say, Figure 1 Celtic Fire Festivals, but it wouldn't have the illustrations. And I was always one of those people that did the homework, the night before it's due to be handed in. So, I edited the thing every year, and then about 2 months before, a month before, I thought I better infer the diagrams from the manuscript and get somebody to draw them. And we had a stall at a Mind Body Spirit Festival, and this guy, woman came up to us with a black rubbish sack, and she put it on the desk, and she said, I think these belong to you. And inside was the illustrations file. So it's when you have experiences like that, because when I had the experience, however vivid it was, because I was doing my degree in psychology, because I was having Jungian analysis at the time, the extraordinary power of the mind to fool itself, basically. So I think, is this my ego? Am I fooling myself? Have I kind of constructed this because I really want to be doing this? But it's when you get synchronistic experiences, I think, that you realise that something else is afoot. So that explains the gap, which you honed in on very astutely.
Well, I'm interested in, so how does Druidry work with those synchronistic experiences?
Okay, so if you think about it, we're beings who are part of our consciousness is constrained within the limits of time and space. There's two dimensions. And Druidry works with space tremendously. There's all this business about tuning into the spiritual place. We now have that little meditation that we did. We basically kind of just opened our awareness to these sort of buildings around us, the earth beneath us, and so on. And you know there's this really interesting way in which different places feel different. You were talking about going to Stonehenge for the solstice. Different places feel different. And every religion and spiritual approach, I think, or certainly most of them, have this interesting relationship with space. There are sacred places, there are pilgrimage routes, there's a kind of honouring of space and a recognition that space is important, our sense of place is important. And then, of course, in astrology, if you look at astrology, you know that where you were born is considered very significant and so on. But we also exist in time. And so Druidry, in common again with many spiritualities, has revered times, special times, you know, the solstices, the equinoxes, and so on, where they act as kind of gateways. Now, the interesting thing is that both space and time provide gateways, and they provide gateways to other levels of consciousness. And whatever the question was, that's a sort of indirect answer to it. What about gateway?
Synchronicity.
Synchronicity, yes, sorry. Yes, synchronicity is where, I've forgotten Jung's definition of it, but it's something about time, isn't it? You know Jung's definition of synchronicity. And the a-causal connecting theory of time or manifestation or something like that. So it's a-causal. So yeah. So somewhere in there is an answer to your question.
So, right, you mentioned that Druidry is very is related to a sense of place, and you've written extensively about sacred places. And so, you know, whether it's your hometown of Lewis, or not your hometown, but your adopted hometown of Lewis, or Stonehenge, or the Ganges. So I guess I was, what is it about these places that is sacred? What makes Lewis more sacred than Southampton?
I won't just go there. Well, I think the question of what makes a place sacred is very interesting, and I think you've got a number of factors. There's the electromagnetic factor. You know, the Earth's electromagnetic field varies, and you have, say, if you're beneath a fault line, or above it, if you don't want to be beneath, don't go beneath the fault line, whatever you do. If you're above a fault line, there's a particular kind of energy that's if you get vast amounts of whatever the stuff is, magma flows and rock and all that stuff, all scrape each other and all that.
Tectonic plates.
Tectonic plates, that's the word. Huge amounts of energy being generated by that, which is bathing your electromagnetic field. And so it varies. So when you go to a sacred place, there's a number of possibilities. I mean, some places are sacred because of historical events. You know, a spiritually important person was born there or died there or gained enlightenment there. I'm not sure about battlefields. Although there is a strange, there is a strange peace on certain battlefields. And those huge war cemeteries in France, I don't know if you've ever been there, but there's a peculiar feeling of peace. So there's something interesting going on perhaps there. But all these factors, I think, you can take a kind of hard-nosed scientific thing and say, well, it's just historical, you know, it's because it is said that the Buddha was enlightened there. But, or you can say it's because it's particularly aesthetically beautiful in certain places. Or you can posit more sort of esoteric theories around conjunctions of ley lines, of the presence of underwater springs. Underwater springs, for instance, are very interesting. If you think about the power in Glastonbury with Chalice Well there, and then the Zamzam spring in Mecca, the central Mecca.
Confluence of factors involved. I guess so. This should go into your therapy practice and how it. So I guess you mentioned somewhere, I don't remember where, that for most of your time, it was actually your therapeutic, your psychology and your psychotherapy practices that influenced your Druidry, not the other way around. And I wonder, what was that?
Yeah, okay. So, when I was 16, 17, 18, and taking psychedelics and smoking pot and hanging out with lots of interesting people and having an amazing time, I was also in this Druid order with ancient people, sort of far younger than me probably now, but they seemed absolutely ancient to me. Who were they were coming out of a kind of Victorian world of magical societies and occult societies. You know, the whole Western magical tradition of, you know, the Golden Dawn, and there's this interesting connection between Druidry and the Golden Dawn, and, you know, the Theosophical Society. So it was one world that I was in was colourful and kind of a bit crazy and a bit risky too, edgy, but exciting, with the music to sort of go with it, as it were. And then the other world was kind of dusty and old-fashioned, but there was something in it that absolutely fascinated me, which was magic, if you like, and spirituality, and what I was trying to do all that time, and nobody, my friends didn't cross it. All my kind of contemporaries thought I was nuts going to these kind of weird Druid ceremonies with these elderly people wearing robes and, you know, and all the rest of it. And of course, my elderly friends in the Druid world would probably be seen dead with that bunch of hippies over there. So they were two very different worlds, but I was moving between the two. And the thing that held the reason why was this area of an interest in consciousness and in what you could call is psycho-spiritual psychology, or spiritual psychology, where psychology and spirituality meet. You know, the great quest, however you want to term it. And when I was asked, in this extraordinary experience, to start leading the order again, to reform it and to spread its teachings, I was faced with a decision to make: do I simply present the rather old-fashioned, dusty stuff to people, or do I inform it with this world, which by then had moved on from the psychedelic world to the world of psychology, because I'd moved on. We're now talking about the end of the 80s, 90s, really. I'd moved on, so I was sort of imbued with this psychosynthesis, psychology, and so on. And I'd followed the guru for a while as well, and so on. So what I did is I saw how those ideas, which are much more contemporary, could illuminate Druidry. So for those 30 years that I was leading the order, what I feel I did is I brought the kind of perspective and some of the techniques or methodologies of spiritual psychology, transpersonal psychology, into Druid teachings. Mm. The big change for me was that cup of tea with Rosalind Watts 3 years ago, because what she told me was that she was working with the Ogham, the Celtic trees, yes. And she was interested in Druidry, and she wanted to find out about that because she was using trees and the spiritual kind of work and understanding of trees to help people in their work of integration after their psychedelic experience. So suddenly I was being invited by clinical psychologists to bring to bear some Druid ideas on. So suddenly my motorway, which was only the traffic for 30 years, had only gone one way, which has gone from the world of psychology into the world of Druidry. Suddenly, Rosalind, in a sense, said, can we open up a contraflow here and have some of this flowing the other way? And so for the last 3 years, I've been involved in this really interesting work of bringing them together.
Yeah. Well, I think that's interesting. So it seems that well, I guess the question is why trees? Well, to give a brief, so the integration system or model that yourself and Rosalind have been developing has trees really at the very core of it. And and ACER, of course, because it's called the ACER Integration. And ACER is the genus.
The maple, yeah.
Oh, the maple.
Maple, genus maple, yeah. And if I can make it clear right from the beginning, Ros herself my input has been very small. She's developed this by reading about the Celtic tree calendar, by reading some very interesting work in ecopsychology, and what I've done is I really encouraged her to follow her intuition, because the great thing about working with trees is that they can teach us, and it felt really not appropriate for me to impose my ideas on a kind of channel of inspiration that she was already in touch with. So just to be clear in terms of the collaboration, that it's very much her project. She had developed a model of working, and it's called ACER because it's accept, connect, embody, restore. And she found in working with psychedelics how this particular sequence of attitudes or behaviors really help the process. So the first thing you learn in a psychedelic experience is to accept. If you start to resist stuff, that you can have problems. You accept, and it's also based on acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT, which is a sort of wonderful fusion of CBT and mindfulness. Actually, rather interesting mix. So accept, connect. There's this whole thing of this. The way to mental health seems to be like through developing connection with individuals, with society, and with the natural world. And then embody another whole level of, it's not just all in the head, and it's not just all in the heart. It's actually about really embodying it.
And psychedelics seem to catalyse that.
It catalyses that, and if you get the model and if you work with it, it's going. The thesis is that it's going to improve your psychedelic experience. Well, improve is perhaps the wrong word, but that it's a way of approaching the psychedelic experience that enables you to sort of get the best out of the experience. Accept, connect, embody, and then restore. Rosalind brought in this idea of restore, bring back that it's not just all about us, but it's about restoring nature and the planet and all the rest of it.
So, what can you? I think it's all very like. How do the trees come into the picture? Because I think it's all very theoretical for us.
Yeah. Okay. The thing about trees is this: is that at the metaphoric level, just at the level of metaphor, they're really powerful because they. You'll see. We just touched on it a bit in our little meditations at the beginning of the evening. You have this. They're rooted in the darkness. Wonderful image for the unconscious, for the connection with ancestry, and with all those ideas of sort of grounding and rootedness. So if you can get in touch with your roots, there's a whole bunch of stuff that you can derive from that in the metaphoric level. And then you've got the trunk, which is the self, as it were, in manifestation. But you can see the trunk, and there are a whole bunch of ideas that you can associate to that around it. This is present time. That's like in the past, connecting down to the deep, dark ancestral part. This is the conscious self, the unconscious, the conscious self, present, the middle world, if you like, from a shamanic perspective. And trees teach us the beauty of age, of woundedness, because some of the most beautiful trees are the kind of twisted ones, are the ones that have been wounded, where a bough has fallen off or whatever. So there's a lot you can get from really accepting the fact that our beauty isn't skin deep, as it were. And then you go up into the branches, and you've got this connection with the gods. It's like connecting to the heavens, the superconscious, the changing seasons, and so on. And so at a metaphoric level, very powerful. We can generate a lot of psychotherapeutic work out of that. If you choose to take a transpersonal perspective and say, maybe this tree has consciousness, maybe this is a being, a very different kind of being, but a being who's intimately tied up with my destiny, with our destiny. Because if the trees aren't here, we're not here, because they create the air that we breathe. And so these really are our brothers and sisters in a completely different form. And to entertain the possibility that trees are more advanced. I'm not saying that Ros suggests this or that it's true. I'm just saying it's quite an interesting. When you come across a truly majestic tree, it's quite interesting to entertain the possibility that this being is more advanced than you. And it opens your heart and mind up in a very interesting way. Yeah.
Is this how you work? Do you work with trees in Druidry in this sort of context?
Hugely, yes. I'm very proud to say that Druids worship trees. We adore trees. And you know that feeling you might get when you see
like the elves, of course.
Like when you see a cute. There's a part of me that wants to get down on my knees when I come towards a huge, beautiful tree. There's a prostrating oneself in front of it feels to me perfectly natural and appropriate and a good thing to do. And yes.
Yeah. So I this brings us into our theme of nature connectedness, which, of course, I mean, it sounds so silly, really, when I talk about it like it's something that is new. But certainly in the neuroscientific and psychological literature, over the last 10 years or so, there's been a resurgence or an insurgence, perhaps, of interest in nature connectedness as it's being empirically measured, right? Which is always the catalyst for these sorts of things, in my experience. And we have, a wide array of empirical evidence that suggests that nature connectedness is an extremely important factor in the well-being of humans. And so, of course, this is like, oh wow, fine, and I'm sure you've been beating this drum for most of your life. And I wonder how you feel about that, and also, what do you do? What can we do to increase our nature connectedness? And there is a difference, and I think this is important, and it's often stressed in the literature, is that there is a difference between just spending time in nature and nature connectedness. I wonder if you could touch on that as well.
Yes. It's about the relationship of consciousness to nature, isn't it? And it seems to be that the more we can be awake and aware of the relationship, the richer the relationship can be. So just as in a human relationship, we can be sort of semi-automatic and semi-unconscious in how we're relating to another person, the more we can be mindful and open to our relationship and the dynamic and what's happening and so on, the richer the relationship can be. So it seems to be with nature. So whilst there are all sorts of benefits that can come from being in nature without applying any level of consciousness, and there are all sorts of interesting studies around number of doctor visits in relation to the tree distribution in a given area. I'm just finishing a book on approaches to insomnia at the moment, and I've come across an interesting study where they relate the connection between tree exposure to tree canopy and quality of sleep. And surprise, people sleep better if they're near trees. So there's all sorts of interesting work being done there. And I think what Druidry is doing, and say the ACER program is doing as well, is saying, look, why not bring your, be aware of the fact that you're in relationship with the world, and deepen your relationship so that you can benefit. And as to what can one do, hopefully nature will benefit as well, because of the way one acts with it.
Okay, how much time are we? 10 minutes. Okay. Yeah, so that was, I think,
Yeah. Should we see what people have? Is it we've been going for an hour, haven't we? Should we see?
Should we take some questions?
Yeah.
Wonderful.
I have one question. So, do you want me to? I can.
Just I'll repeat your question.
Oh, so my question is basically, considering there's like new research looking into how like trees have like mycelium, kind of connecting them together. And I don't know if you've ever been in a forest where they just have it for like, they like plant trees in rows and there's like no like biodiversity. Those forests are horrible, but then when you have a forest with a lot of biodiversity and like a lot of like undergrowth and stuff, it seems to have quite a different energy. How does Druidry like, because there's obviously this emphasis on trees, but what about mycelium and mushrooms? And I don't mean like magic mushrooms, I just mean mushrooms in general, like, you know, that kind of...
Absolutely, that's...
Can I just repeat the question for the online audience? So the question was about the relationship between, you know, the forests that have been planted, you know, with no regard to mycelium and to permaculture and natural forests and the way that Druidry works with mycelium.
And whether we attend to more than just trees. Yeah, exactly. No, I mean, that's precisely the point. Really, the whole. I think that, you know, that wonderful book by, is it Anne Simard or Anne Simard, who did this original work. She was working in forestry up in Canada and sort of they cleaned the roots before planting the trees so that they, you know, and she's written a wonderful book called The Mother Tree, where she's looked at this and that whole awareness of interconnectedness is precisely what Druidry is encouraging, what the ACER programme is encouraging, is that you can and just as in human relations, you know, there's this really interesting thing. It's like you can really appreciate the uniqueness of an individual, and if you see the commonalities and the universalities in them, rather than it detracting from your appreciation of them, it can deepen your relationship with that individual even more. Do you see what I mean? It's like, so if I can say that again in another way, it's like, so I fall in love with somebody, and I fall in love with them because they seem to be unique, utterly unique. As I get to know them, I discover that actually, in addition to their uniqueness, they're just like everybody else. And there's something very beautiful about that. You know, there's something very beautiful when we recognise our commonality as well as our uniqueness. You know. So yeah.
Yes?
Yeah, so I have a question, but I also just wanted to entertain your idea about the complexity of trees and how they could potentially transcend our own. I always like to think of the trunk of a tree and its bark being that much more powerful than our flimsy skin. And if we were to, you know, shoot a bow and arrow at a tree, it would be basically unfazed, and they survive forest fires. So obviously they're onto something that our skin hasn't really caught up to. I was interested in sort of entertaining the limits of, I guess, Druidry or your deep reverence for nature, specifically talking about that sort of trance that you saw when you were part of that group following this guru, and you saw that there was an element to that was almost ignorant of something deeper. And Mother Nature can also be a great bitch. And I was wondering, in what way should we face that awful and awesome nature because it can be such a force of destruction?
Yes, absolutely. And the other thing that your question reminds me of, sorry, it's going to be hard for you to recap a lot. Let's just try to point out my... Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Ken
Wilber, the American philosopher, psychologist, talks about the pre-trans fallacy, where he talks about the problem he sees a lot of pagans falling into, of sort of nature worship, and he sees it as a kind of regressive thing, of just getting hung up on a thing again, instead of kind of trying to go beyond. And I think it's important to be aware of that, which is something perhaps of what you were hinting towards. you see, the really interesting thing about Druidry is this, and maybe other nature spiritualities as well, but in Druidry, you're getting this twofold thing happening. They're saying, on the one hand, the message is, look, you're not the only guy on the block. There's this whole world out there, and it's amazing. And the quest is not just for your own personal salvation or your own personal enlightenment. There's this, we're all in this together, and the physical world and the world of nature is real and beautiful and valuable and needs to be treasured and worshipped and supported and the rest of it. But at the same time, there's this belief in the other world, in the fact that this isn't the only reality, this isn't the only world, and that we can also enter other states. So it's paradoxical in a way. So it's a question of identification and disidentification. And I think if one can somehow work with that idea, that's part of the approach. I think that could be helpful.
Would you describe that almost as a kind of non-dualism?
You could see it that way, yeah.
Robin?
Yeah, continuing with the trees. Today I felt very strongly that I wanted to go to a favourite graveyard that's been very forgotten because they put a motorway very close to it, and somehow the village is disappearing. But there are some wonderful old graves there, and one of the graves says in big letters, "Ecologist." So that man from the 60s maybe was just in that consciousness. And I'm quite sure that I was called there by a sense of needing the consciousness of this man in the ground calling out to us, and also the trees of that graveyard. Because quite often now, modern graveyards don't seem to have a lot of trees, but this was an old graveyard, and it seemed to be weeping, along with the trees and the roots, imagining the roots going into the body of the people buried there. And it must have been a very powerful sense to put someone into the ground and surrender them to the roots of the trees.
That's why woodland burial sites are so wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But if you have any comment on going back into Druidry, the roots of Druidry must have also been very much involved with burials and all that kind of stuff.
Yes, and this whole idea of the idea of reincarnation, for instance, which is central to Druidry, and of the ancestors, this idea of the ancestors. A strong strand for those who want to work with that. Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah. How much can we know about ancient Druidry, and how would you say it relates to the modern style?
How much would you know?
How much can we know about ancient Druidry?
How much can we know about ancient Druidry, and how does it relate to the modern style?
Right, because I've heard there was a problem with sources.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. So way back. So you've got 300 years of recorded history of books and manuscripts that you can look at. So that take us back to a period called the Druid Revival, from the kind of 18th century, late 17th century, which occurred in Germany and France and Britain. And then you've got 1,000 years gap, and then you've got what you might call the classical Druids, the people that Julius Caesar, the classical authors, the Greeks and the Romans, wrote about. You've got a bit of sort of archaeology, which is kind of very tricky because, as with all the psychology, it's very hard to surmise what actually it represents and so on. So the ancient Druidry, the sources of ancient Druidry are very slim. So you have to say that it's inspired by the classical accounts of the ancient Druids, which may or may not be accurate,
were not written by the Druids themselves.
And were not written by the Druids themselves. You have a sort of 11th century medieval texts, Christian texts writing about the Druids. But again, that's a long way from the ancient Druids. But again, they might be kind of windows on that world. What you have is luckily, Christian scribes and scholars had a kind of, as Ronald Hutton put it, a love affair with the pagan past in these wonderful ways. It's sort of tempestuous and sometimes sort of violent love affair, because sometimes on the one hand they repressed cults and paganism, when they came into contact with it, but on the other hand they were kind of enamored of it and they wrote the old stories down. So I like to sort of image that I like to think of as a sort of door closing in about the 6th century AD, as paganism, pre-Christian cults were finally kind of erased by Christianity, because Christianity had a monopolist agenda. The Romans didn't. They were kind of canny, and they just allowed different cults to flourish, and so they occasionally cracked down if there was some sort of problems, like with Boudica and so on. But they allowed them. When the Christians came, they had essentially a monopolist agenda. So by the 6th century, most of Europe, with sort of interesting exceptions like sort of Lithuania and things like that, where things happened later. But by the 6th century, the door was closed, but they were writing these stories down. So, to what degree the ideas and teachings of the ancient Druids can be found in those ancient stories, we don't know. But the reason why in the Order of Bards, Ovates and Druids we use as a central teaching story in our training the story of Taliesin, who was this young boy who becomes the finest poet in the land, is because it feels incredibly ancient, really primal, and it's telling a kind of archetypal story of initiation and of opening to one's creativity and one's sort of maturity. It's a coming of age story as well. So it's a very rich story, and it can be traced back. I think the earliest manuscripts are around the 11th, 10th centuries, but scholars are pretty sure that you can date it to the 9th century, sort of starting to get closer, and it seems to address so much of so many of the ideas in Druidry.
You're not of the opinion that Druidism continued throughout after the Christianization of Britain in some kind of secret manner underground, which is the notion that somehow it's popular and then through into witchcraft and all of these things.
I think you've got a much more what's the word? If you can see, by the time you reach the sort of peak of classical Druidry, Druids were the sort of elite in some ways. They had exemption from taxes, they had exemption from military service. So you can start to build a picture. These guys were, a privileged group. They were advisors to tribal leaders, and one of their jobs was making peace amongst warring tribes. And then they were the judges in Ireland. We've got some interesting material from Ireland because they were judges and they made the laws and so on as well. And there is some interesting actually stuff on the Brehon laws, which probably carries Druid teachings through. So there's a lot of interesting material, and so what happened? My sense of what happened is when Christianity finally took over, because these were people in positions of power and authority anyway, they just hoisted up a different flag, and so some of them became Christian priests, some of them, they were kind of integrated into society, and so yeah.
Yes.
Hello.
You speak louder.
Sorry. It's a bit off topic, but I grew up right next to Stonehenge, and I was just wondering. I'm sure you know about the tunnel that's going to be built under it. I was wondering what are the repercussions of that on the Druid community as kind of a site of great sacred significance.
Yes, so the lady was saying that she grew up near Stonehenge, and she was wondering how the Druid community feels about the tunnel that's being proposed to be built, the sort of underpass to take the traffic, to really take it out of the way, to make the site of Stonehenge quieter and less dominated by this road with all the traffic hammering down it. There was you used the word druid community, which is an interesting one because there's this sort of joke that goes, you ask 10 druids their opinion on something and you get 12 answers, and so it's impossible to have one community response to that. And so there's the whole range of responses in the druid community, if you like, between people who campaign vigorously against it to people who feel that perhaps it might be a good thing that the Stonehenge will be capable of being perhaps sensed as a sacred site more effectively if the traffic's got out of the way.
Okay. Yes.
I have a question. I want to flow it into a question. So I think that the question about the kind of what does Druidry looks like today versus the indigenous roots that it came from. I think one of the profound things about Druidry is it does have indigenous roots. We did have our own indigenous culture here, and I think a lot of people are surprised to discover that, and I know I was. We have evidence of, there were animal skins, big antlered headdresses. They deposited items of value into the earth and made offerings. We have evidence of sweat lodges and smudging, burning of incense. And I think that's really significant because we're seeing a lot of calls for indigenous, more perspectives these days. A lot of braiding sweetgrass, some other books, a lot of indigenous voices being valued in academia. And so while Druidry doesn't, it's questionable of how much it resembles the indigenous roots, what's clear is there were indigenous roots here. There were other ways of being and knowing and engaging with the world. And that's something I feel like Druidry is trying to bring into the world. Other ways of being, of knowing and engaging. And so I'm curious, with that said, what do you think Druidry has to kind of offer in these conversations and in these realms? Can you speak more to the aspects of cosmology and practice that you feel are conductive to, other ways of being and knowing, and particularly those, I guess, that would mesh well with the psychedelic experience?
Well, I think when we look at the world today and the problems in the world, what we really need fresh perspectives and different perspectives. And what's that famous quote from? Was it Einstein or somebody who said you can't solve a problem at the level that it was created? And when you see particularly war happening, that seems to drive that home so strongly. In this time of kind of crisis that we're in, perspectives that honour the natural world and that tap into these roots that you mentioned so clearly, I think can be really valuable. I think that the problem can sometimes be when we're looking for answers, whereas perspectives don't necessarily provide answers, they provide perspectives. Do you see what I mean? So it's not like I can come up with some kind of glib or not glib, profound and wonderful response as an answer. But perhaps what it can do is it can just shift our perception. And that brings to mind the value of psychedelics, in as much as it seems that they can change people's perceptions and perspectives and understandings and feelings in a way that seems to be positive and helpful. And I suppose the hope is, with this psychedelic renaissance, is that can have wider repercussions from simply the personal perspective. In other words, what I think a lot of people in the psychedelic sort of movement today are hoping is not just that individuals are going to have amazing experiences that can help them lead more profound lives, but there will be some wider repercussions of that for the well-being of humanity.
And for people who haven't taken psychedelics.
Yes, and it can seem very overblown when one says it. It seems like grandiose in some way or overly optimistic. But nevertheless, that's certainly a belief amongst many people in it. And I don't know if you agree with me in the psychedelic movement today.
Yes, certainly. Yeah. And do you think that the psychedelics have invoke a druidic sensibility?
I think the interesting the reason why I'm enjoy so much the work that I'm doing with the Synthesis Institute in the end, is that their particular approach is to take a very responsible, very science-based approach to the use of psychedelics, but at the same time to look at it and approach it with a deep appreciation and respect for indigenous wisdom. And, so they asked me to do summer solstice ceremonies for them and so on, and it was during lockdown online and so on. And we study other indigenous cultures and their approach to psychedelics and so on. And I think that's another interesting contribution that psychedelics perhaps have, is that they're walking this sort of path that includes, can include, and that's why I feel very hopeful about this psychedelic renaissance, because of course when I was a kid, when people were taking psychedelics, it was the sort of Wild West. It was kind of pretty uncontrolled, with some of the downsides that brought with it. Now I think we're being allowed a second crack at it, as it were, to get it right. Yeah. Do we have to wrap up? That's just one more thing.
We'll do one more, yeah.
One more.
Charles? Hello. You mentioned Nicolas Chavier's earlier, and I was just thinking that I have memorised it, but I was wondering if you could tell it.
Oh, well, that's very sweet of you. I think there isn't enough time.
I have it down to 3 or 4 minutes.
You
want to give it a quick try?
You want to offer it now?
Yeah.
Do it. Have you got 3 minutes or 4 minutes?
Trying to keep it short, Don.
Okay.
Come up to the mic. Should we wrap up first? And then we'll have it afterwards.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll wrap up first.
Come and sit here, and we'll wrap up, and then
yeah.
Okay. Marvellous.
So yes, yes. You were talking about so many different things.
I'm sorry.
Throughout your whole thing. No, I'm sorry as well. So many different things. I don't know if we can give everyone an aphorism.
A closing thought.
Closing thought.
A closing thought. Okay. Let's bring. What we did at the beginning of the evening, there's just those few moments of connecting to the earth, the trees around us, the sky above us. It's so simple, but it's the kind of practice that even if we take just one element, like the earth, and just do it, during the day, if we just become aware of the trees. It's a to talk about these things and to explore these things too.
Well, it's great that we can enfranchise the analytic world into this now, and it seems that is actually a very beautiful thing. That it's an outstretching of the hand in a way that goes very well.
Just a couple of notes. The first is that at OPS we try to put all our events on for free. Best way to support us is by buying our merch, which is over here. Scarlett, if you want to raise your hand.
Hello.
It's our merch officer. She'll be selling merch after the event. And the second thing is we're going to the pub. Both Phillips will be joining us. And it'll be the King's Arms. So not the King's Arms. Okay, we'll go.
Lamb and Flag.
We're going to go to the Lamb and Flag instead. Sorry.
And there's a beautiful horse chestnut tree outside.
There's a beautiful horse chestnut tree.
Excellent. But yeah, just stick around if you want to join us at the pub afterwards.
And I'm going to quickly do that story, right?
Yeah.
Is that
Great.
good?
Yeah.
Okay, so the story begins with Carr-Gomm, who is a witch, who has a very, very stupid son, I believe, is part of the story, that she looks after night and day. And in order to try and cure her son's stupidity, she creates a magic potion. And the magic potion requires constant stirring in order to make it. I mean, I guess think of the ayahuasca thing, right? You have to basically keep constantly stirring this brew to stop it from, denaturizing or whatever, or going wrong. But she gets tired, so she decides that she's going to employ, she's going to enslave a young man to do this for her. So she goes to the village. Somehow, I'm not sure how she manages that wild skin sort of thing. Maybe she gets idiot sons of stir the potion while she's in the village, I don't know. And then she finds a young man called Guion, who she brings back to her witchy house, and she says, "You're going to stir this for me night and day, and you're never going to stop. And if you stop, I shall know. And if you drink any of this potion, I shall know. So if I find out that you've stopped or that you've drunk my potion, I'm going to kill and eat you." So Guion is obviously suitably impressed by this threat, because he knows about Carr-Gomm's fearsome nature. So he starts to stir and stir and stir and stir and stir and stirs and stirs all night long, all day long. And he gets tired and a bit careless. And one afternoon, while he thinks that Carr-Gomm is asleep, he's stirring, and he does it a bit too fast, and he splashes some of it, which leaps out and lands on his thumb. And without thinking, because the potion is hot, "Oh no, what have I done?" He swallows some of the magic potion. Now the magic potion, of course, because it was meant to cure Carr-Gomm's son of idiocy, gave him all the knowledge of all magics instantaneously. And he thought to himself, right, I need to get out of here, because the witch is going to kill and eat me. So he ran out of the house, he ran towards the forest, and he heard the screams of Carr-Gomm behind him. And he thought, gosh, if she'll spot me in my human form, and he suddenly decides he's going to change into a deer. And he runs through the forest as a deer, ducking and diving between the trees, and behind him comes Carr-Gomm, and Carr-Gomm, in order to chase him through the forest, changes herself into a wolf. And he runs and runs through the forest, the biting jaws of the wolf he can feel snapping at his deer-like tail as he runs through the forest. And he runs beside a river, and he thinks the only way out of this is to change into a fish. So he jumps into the water and transforms himself into an otter. And the otter swims down the river, escaping from the wolf. The wolf, who is Carr-Gomm, realizes cannot keep up with the pike in the river, so the otter in the river jumps into the water, turns into a pike, and chases, snapping at the otter's feet with her horrible, sharp, pincer-like jaws. Well, as Carr-Gomm is catching up, again, Guion thinks to himself, I must escape this, what am I going to do? So he leaps out of the water and transforms himself into a sparrow. I think a sparrow. A wren.
Different versions. Yeah.
Or a lark, I don't know. A beautiful bird that can fly high, flies up into the sky, and of course, Carr-Gomm realizes that the prey is gone and also leaps out as a pike, transforming magically in the air into a sparrow hawk, and chases Guion through the air, over hill and dale, until eventually the sparrow is tiring and flagging and thinks to itself, I can't carry on much longer like this, looks down and sees a farmstead. In the farmstead, in the middle of the courtyard, there is a huge pile of grain, and so Guion, with a cunning thought, decides to change into a grain, a single piece of corn or barley that falls out of the sky, lands on top of the pile of barley in the yard. He breathes a sigh of relief, or at least he would if he had any lungs at that point. But no, is that the end? It is not, because of course Carr-Gomm is also cunning and flies down, lands and changes from a sparrowhawk into a chicken and pecks at the pile of grain, pecks and pecks and boots boldly and pecks and pecks and pecks until eventually there is one grain left and Carr-Gomm finally eats Guion, the grain. At that point, Carr-Gomm thinks, I've won, I've beaten this stupid ingenue who's stolen my magic, and goes back in her human form, back to her witchy house on the edge of the lake with her idiot son. But what happens is that she discovers herself full of child, gravid, with a baby. She thinks, where can this baby come from? I certainly haven't had any nookie for quite a long time. And 9 months later, out pops a magical, beautiful baby that she realizes is Guion, who is a bait to capture once again. And this is the birth